Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this 1800 watt Sportsman inverter generator. This one was sent to us by a subscriber, Lauren, who picked it up in non-running condition. He said the engine was actually stuck and it didn't take much to get the engine to rotate again. He actually said it felt quite normal and he thought he was home free once the engine started to turn over normally. That said though, it didn't run. I believe he cleaned the carb, still no joy. And then he checked the compression and found that there was low compression. He was only seeing 25 PSI. So he ended up pulling the head off the engine, inspected the bore, said it looked fine. And he lapped the valves in while he was there, closed it up, set the clearance, and yet the compression didn't come up any. He has never heard this engine even attempt to run. So it was at that point he checked for spark and found there was none. So he threw a new coil in and yet no spark. So I think at that point he threw in the towel. He had this machine apart quite a few times and really nothing to show for it. So he sent it to us hoping we could breathe some new life into this machine. So let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on this. So I know this was shipped without oil in it. I do want to put some in. You can do that right here, but I'm thinking let's just take the whole side off. It sounds like it's unavoidable that we're going to have to open this machine up. We are missing some hardware. We can replace that, if it gets to that point. All right, and this, it looks like a Yamaha clone, which is probably a good thing because this machine, although it has a parts diagram in the user manual, they don't actually sell any parts for it. So if we do end up needing something like rings or a piston, likely we're going to have to try an OEM Yamaha part. Yeah, plenty of oil to test with, which from the sounds of it, we may not need the oil unless it actually runs. So let's start by checking for spark since we're here. All right, let's give this a try. Keep an eye on the light. The ignition is turned on. So when I pull the engine over, that should light up if everything's working. So yeah, no spark on this engine. So even if the compression is good, it's never going to run. So we do need to figure that out. Before we take this apart any further though, let's get a compression tester in there if we can and see where the compression's at. Wow, that plug is tight. Oh. There we go. It's brand new. Never been fired on. All right, keep an eye on the compression tester. This does have a compression release, so usually around 60 PSI is all we're going to see. Plus or minus 10 PSI is pretty normal, so I want to see at least 50 PSI. we're actually at about 52, 53. So I don't think compression's the issue. I mean, maybe it was, but I'd say that issue was fixed by Lauren. The bigger issue is lack of spark. So yeah, to figure that out, we do need to start peeling some covers here so that we can get better access to the ignition coil. And this is actually CDI driven as well, so there are other parts to the system we need to check out. So one thing worth noting too is that not all compression testers are created equal. You know, this one has a Schrader valve right down here where it screws into the engine, and you know, a lot of them have it up on the gauge, which, you know, it doesn't seem like a big deal where it is, but it actually is on something this small, because the piston, you know, it's compressing the air and that's what you're trying to measure. But if you add a long tube, well, now you have a larger volume of air, so that compression is actually spread out and you don't get an accurate read on that gauge. But when you have the valve down here, it still gets to full compression and just pushes the compression into this tube until everything is equalized. So, you know, if you're testing really any engine, you should use a compression tester with the Schrader valve down on the tip. So I need to get, I think, most of these skins off to get access to what we need, which is the ignition system. So I'm going to start just by taking the plastic off right here and on the side. And likely we're going to have to keep going and just get the entire clamshell off. Interesting. Although the knob's been removed, the valve is actually attached to the back side of this cover. So we do need to somehow reach in there and get that removed. I think we need to get it from this side. There's a clear shot straight through to the screw holding that valve on. All right, we have access to a lot of the ignition components. You know, I now can see the ignition coil. The main lead going to the plug actually goes up and over the engine. And on the other side of the coil, we have these two wires coming out of it. And they connect into this wire harness right here, which looks to run over to the inverter module. So the CDI potentially is integrated with that. So hopefully that is not the issue. We should also have an oil sensor, which usually exits on the side of the engine. You know, potentially that's it right there, although I'm thinking that's actually likely a smaller coil to power the ignition system. And there should also be an impulse generator, which, you know, sometimes is on the flywheel. You know, in this case, though, it looks like they put it on the generator. You know, we have this right here, which looks like a pickup coil. And that, when a magnet passes it, generates a little bit of power. It sends a pulse of electricity over, and that actually comes over right here and into the same harness. So it needs that signal to know when to fire the plug. And yeah, it could be the oil sensor, it could be the pulse generator, but I'm actually leaning towards that because when I look at it, there's a pretty big gap between the magnet and the impulse generator. And with that kind of a gap, I'm not sure it's going to pick up the pulse. Now, I don't know what the gap should be, but from looking at this as it is right now, it looks to be about 3/16 of an inch, that gap. And I'm thinking it should be much, much smaller, probably closer to 10 thousandths of an inch. So I'm going to rotate the engine until I find the magnet. We'll loosen up these bolts, set the gap, and we'll check for spark again. All right, there's the magnet. I'm just going to align it a little bit better because it is raised, and we want to make sure we get a good gap of 10 thousandths between the magnet and the pickup coil. All right, so right now a 25 thousandths feeler gauge fits in there with a bit of drag. So the gap isn't gigantic, but 25 may not sound like a lot, but for something like this, it really needs to be close to that magnet. So I'm hoping that's going to be it. So I'm going to loosen up those bolts. We'll set it to 10 thousandths and see if that makes a difference. All right, let's try that out. Unfortunately, that made no difference. So there's a few things we can check here to try to track down the problem. So I'm going to start with the pulse generator, since we know that is now gapped properly. I'm going to test the resistance. And, I don't know what it should be, but I want to see that it's not open circuit. And we're at 127 ohms. So that seems reasonable. It at least has a chance of working. The other test we can do actually is to put this to measure volts AC. And I can pull the engine over, and we should see a little bit of voltage being generated. And we do. It's not much. It's about half a volt. But it is working. So let's check what I think is the oil sensor. We'll check that to ground. So with no oil, this wire should send a ground signal. So I'm going to connect one lead to the engine ground. We'll flip this back to measure ohms. And we want to see that it's open circuit like it is now. And it is. So the oil switch is not grounding out. So that isn't the problem either. So let's check the coil itself. Now these two wires, they feed the primary. You know, on this machine, I don't know what the primary should be, but it usually tests very low on Honda generators. So I'm expecting to see a fairly low value. And we do, 1.2 ohms. So that seems correct. We can also test the secondary, but we have to go to the other side to check that. And it'll be a very similar test here. So I'm going to connect one of the leads to ground. We're set to measure resistance. And we'll put a probe here in the secondary. And on most coils for Hondas, it's usually around 10 to 15,000 ohms. In this case, we're 16.6 thousand. So yeah, no smoking gun. You know, everything so far is checking out. So the coil that's on here now, it's not the original coil that came on the machine. I think once he realized he had no spark, he purchased a new coil. So that's what's on there right now. This is the original coil. He did include that. So I want to test the same thing here. I'm going to test the primary. Make sure it reads the same, which was about an ohm. Yeah, 1.2, exactly the same. And we'll check the secondary. And interesting. I get absolutely nothing on the secondary. So either the original coil is bad or potentially the boot is bad. So let's just take this off. I believe this has a resistor in it. So, you know, the value we saw here of 16,000 ohms without the cap, it's going to be a lot lower, probably around 11,000. So let's see if we get a reading now. And we don't. Huh. Well, that is interesting. So I guess that just begs the question. This one seems to test fine, but we don't have spark. This one doesn't seem to test fine, but I wonder if it has spark. You know, I don't know how this ignition works, and we have two wires going in, most likely some electronics here, so potentially the primary shouldn't have a connection normally. So I'm thinking, let's put the boot back on and actually hook this one up and see if this will produce a spark. So we don't actually need to commit to test this coil. We can just ground it out like that, plug it in, add the spark tester, and we'll check for spark again. Nice. We've got spark. So this old coil, although it tested a little funny, seems to work because the new one, which tested well, isn't doing anything at all. So I'm thinking let's get this coil on. Actually, before we do that, let's throw a plug in and just make sure the spark can jump the gap. All right, hopefully you can see this okay. Keep an eye on the tip of the plug. We want to see that spark jump the gap. Yep. No issues jumping that gap. So it wasn't sitting too well with me that the secondary was open circuit. I've never seen that before, and I don't think it's normal. So I decided to check it again now that we're all plugged in and installed. And to my surprise, we're not open circuit anymore. We're at 5,000 ohms. So that coil actually tests well. And I thought I would double check the boot as well to make sure that this is not open circuit. This has a resistor in it. So usually these come in at about 5 or 10,000 ohms. And in this case, we're pretty much at 10,000. So the old coil, I think it's good. Well, we know it's good because it works. So this will run on propane as well as gasoline. So let's try it on propane first. All right, let's give this a try. I've got a light plugged in and turned on. I've made sure the fuel valve for the gasoline is shut off because that would be a vacuum leak. And I've also got the propane turned on. So let's give it a few pulls, see what we get. Try it with the choke. Choke off. Choke on. And we get nothing. So we had no signs of life trying to start this on propane. So I did remove the propane line. I put gasoline in the tank, the fuel valve's on. So let's try this again. The choke on. Let's try it with the choke off. I'm kind of surprised this didn't fire up. I thought for sure it was. We found that there was no spark. We fixed that problem. We tested the compression, and the compression is fine. Like, this should start. And instead it is showing no signs of life. So either we have an issue with timing or with fuel. And usually I would say fuel, but in this case we tried 2 different sources of fuel and still nothing from the engine. So yeah, I think we are going to have to dig into the timing, but before I do that, let's just make sure that fuel isn't the issue. So I'm going to pull the airbox off. We'll try feeding a bit of fuel directly and see if that makes any difference. All right, let's try this again. Nothing. And still we get nothing from this machine. So yeah, it could be timing, but it's very rare. And just as a double check, I did put my hand here over the exhaust and pulled the engine over just to make sure the spark arrestor wasn't restricting flow of air. And that is clear. You know, I can feel a pulse of air. And then I did the same actually on the carburetor, and I did not feel any pulse of air. So that tells me either there's an obstruction in the throat of the carburetor, or maybe there's a problem with the intake valve where it's not opening. So I'm thinking we do need to dig deeper and get the skins fully off so we can get better access to that valve cover and see what's going on with the valves. All right, looks like both push rods are in place. Let's pull the engine, see if the intake moves. Well, we have good news and bad news. We'll start with the good. The intake seems to open and close without issue, and the valve clearance, by feel is pretty close. Neither valve is too tight, so the engine should run with the valves set the way that they are. But when rotating the engine with the valve cover off, I couldn't help but notice there was smoke coming out of this area, and there's really only two reasons that would happen. Either we have a blown head gasket, or we have stuck or worn piston rings. And some of that exhaust smoke is making its way down into the engine and then getting pushed out through the valves. So yeah, neither one's good. Both require at least a partial, if not a full, teardown. And I'm thinking the easiest way to tell which one it is probably to pull the plug. We'll put some oil in the cylinder that will kind of form a temporary seal around the piston and the cylinder. And we'll add a little bit of starting fluid right there and pull it over. If it starts to kick, then we know we have a bad set of rings or potentially a damaged cylinder. Actually, I'm going to take the back cover off. Looks like it's mostly off already. You can still see the smoke coming out. trying. Nope, it's not going to start. It was trying. We got one, maybe two good kicks out of it, but it just couldn't start. So, yeah, things, I think they're making a little bit more sense. There was a spark problem, but that wasn't the problem. You know, we have issues with leak down, and that could be seen by the amount of smoke pouring out of the block. So, you know, it's either a bad head gasket or stuck rings, and I'm leaning strongly towards the stuck rings, given that adding oil to the cylinder sealed it up enough to get a couple good kicks out of it. Plus, this engine was stuck and it was freed up, but I'm thinking the piston rings are likely still stuck. And the only way we're going to know that for sure is if we tear the engine down. We actually need to get the piston out to get a better look at it. So yeah, let's start peeling the layers to get access to what we need. So this here is the propane regulator, and we just need to get it loose so we can kind of move it out of the way so we can slide the carb off the studs. Yeah, a lot of times you can unplug these, but not this one. At least not up here. So, you know, we can remove it from this whole bracket assembly, but there is a spring and a little plastic piece that'll launch if I do that. So it might be a better idea just to slide it off for now. And when we get more access, we can actually unplug the wire, I believe, right from the inverter module. It looks like the engine is held on just by a bolt right here and a bolt right there on both sides. So when those are removed, you know, I think we can kind of twist this around, which will give us access to the inverter so we can unplug all these wires. I'm pretty impressed with the way that came apart so easily. You know, the engine lifted right out, nothing to it, and now we almost have access to what we need. We do need to get the generator off so we can get the cover off and gain access to the internals of the engine. So I'm thinking we actually need to start with the exhaust. We'll get that out of the way and then start getting the generator itself off. Those are some pretty strong magnets. Anyway, it's off. Nothing's damaged on the stator, and the magnets look to be in good condition. So next, we need to get this free. And that, I think, is going to be a challenge because I can't get a puller on there either. You know, it looks like this takes a specialized puller of some sort, which I don't have. So if we're lucky, we can remove the nut and just slide this off the crankshaft, but I have a feeling it's not going to be that easy. Anyway, let's remove the nut and see how far we get. Nope, can't get that lucky. Yeah, so it is tempting to thread this on, put a little pressure on the back and hit it. But there's two problems with that plan. The fan is in the back, it's plastic, so you can't pry against it. And then we have the magnet problem as well, where you could break these magnets. So striking to free this, it's not an option. So I'm going to try a puller, if I can get it in there. And I'm not going to be able to apply a ton of force, or else I risk bending this metal. But I should be able to apply a fair amount of force. And maybe, just maybe, that'll be enough. Yeah, that's quite a bit of force, and it's not budging. Might tap that lightly, but I can't tap it too much or else I'm going to cause damage. And now that is not working. We're also on here a little bit crooked, which isn't helping. Well, I'm going to put the brakes on this. You know, the puller I had, it's not the right tool, and it's not able to pull this off. So I don't want to keep going because I am going to cause damage to this. You know, I think what I need is a motorcycle style puller. And even that's a long shot because this is the inverse of what most bikes use. That said, some bikes do use this style, and I think I can find something that'll work. So I've been taking a few measurements. You know, the thread pitch seems to be a 1.5 millimeter. And as far as the major diameter, that's a little bit harder to tell because I can't quite get the caliper in there properly because it's hitting right here. But every time I take a measurement, it's somewhere between 26 and 27 millimeters. So I'll just order probably both pullers, hoping that one of them will work. Now, even if we get this off, getting this repaired is going to be a long shot. There is a parts diagram in this manual, but as far as I can tell, none of those parts were ever sold. There are no torque specs, so even replacing the gasket might be impossible, and getting a new set of rings will be very difficult if it comes to that. Regardless, it's not going to run unless we do something. So we need to keep going and just see how bad it is. And with any luck, we can free those rings and get this up and running again. Yeah, so I'm thinking before ordering that puller, let's get the head off. I want to inspect the condition of that head gasket. Regardless, the head has to come off even if we have bad rings because the piston is going to come out the top. So before actually pulling the head, I'm going to rotate the engine to top dead center, and I want to do a leak down test. We know it passed the compression test, but obviously the compression's leaking out pretty quickly, which is why this engine won't start. So I want to get a baseline where we're at, and also by pressurizing the cylinder, that will allow us to see exactly where the leak is. So this is the leak down tester right here. We have a pressure regulator and of course the line going to the cylinder. Now, as we bring the pressure up, it might rotate the engine, in which case we're going to have to reset to top dead center because as soon as the engine rotates, a valve is likely to open. Right now they are closed. So if I add pressure to the cylinder, it shouldn't leak, although most engines leak a bit. So ideally, in a perfect engine, you'd have 0% leak down, but in practice, it's closer to 10% on a really healthy engine. And, I've had ones all the way up to like 50% that still ran pretty well. So I'm bringing up the pressure. This is the pressure in the cylinder, 40 PSI. And this needle should be tracking pretty close if we weren't leaking. And you can see we're at 60 PSI and we're at about 90 or 85% leak down. So yeah, that needle should be way over here. So we have significant leak down. Tiny bit maybe from the intake. Nothing from the exhaust. And if we didn't have these plastics on here, we could check around the head gasket. But I don't think we need to because all the pressure is coming out right here. There's a access port right here that connects the bottom end to the top end. And there's a lot of pressure leaking down. I don't know if you can see it when I put the towel in front of it, but it's blowing it up. So yeah, that should not be happening. So, the likely cause is bad rings. There's a very tiny chance that it's the head gasket. So let's get the rest of these plastics off and get that head off the engine. Head gasket looks to be in pretty good shape. So this is the vent I was talking about here that connects the bottom end to the top end. And if there was a breach between here, that would explain what we're seeing. In this case, I'm thinking, it must be going past the rings. And the cylinder actually doesn't look great. Let me get you up there real close to see. Yeah, it's not great. I'm not going to lie. This is something that you might condemn an engine for. That said, though, it doesn't feel bad. I think it's more of a stain than anything else. And I'm willing to bet, honing that for a couple minutes will get rid of most of that stain. So, yeah, a new set of rings, a quick hone, it should bring this engine back around. I guess the question is, are we going to be able to get to its rated load of 1800 watts? And that we won't know until we try. So I think it is worth at least moving forward and ordering that puller so we can get the engine opened up and see what we see. Hopefully there was no water in the bottom end, but as bad as this is, I think it can be cleaned up. So yeah, let's get the puller ordered up and we will proceed. It's been about 6 weeks, so let me catch you up real quick. We last left off saying that I needed a puller, and I wasn't completely sure if it was an M27 or an M26. I couldn't quite get the caliper on there properly. So, I took a few more measurements and decided it was most likely an M27. So I ordered this M27 1.5 puller from eBay, and a week later it showed up, and I was kind of sad to see that it was the wrong size. It just goes right over the thread. So, I thought, fine. I couldn't quite get a good measurement. It must be an M26. So I ordered one of those up. And this one has the opposite problem. It will not go on the threads. It is actually too small. So, I was kind of scratching my head wondering how this could be. It's either an M26 or an M27. There's no size in between. And yet neither one fits. So it wasn't until I measured the inner diameter that I realized the one advertised as an M27 is actually a lot closer to an M29. So they sent the wrong part. So I ordered another M27 puller, this time from Amazon, completely different seller. And this one is even worse. I think this one's closer to an M32. So, yeah, these guys apparently don't know how to measure. And, this size, it's an odd size, too. I looked for alternatives and really couldn't find any until I stumbled across a German site called Motor Tools. Now, this one, I would say, took a good 3 weeks to get shipped to the US. But I should have done it to start with because this M27 1.5 actually threads right on. So, yeah, let's get this generator off. So I'm going to try to avoid using the impact on this. I don't want to damage the magnets. Something happens. It's amazing how the right tool makes a job so much easier. That generator came off with almost zero effort. So now we have access to open the crankcase up. But before I do that, there is oil in the engine, so let's get that drained out. And I also want to pull the flywheel because likely we're going to have to remove the crankshaft to clean up that cylinder. Not much of a flywheel. It's just a starter cup and a fan. Haven't seen that before. I kind of messed up on this one. Usually I pull flywheels off. That is the safest way to do it. Of course, it's not a flywheel. It's cast aluminum, and as you can tell, it is quite brittle. So, I thought it was a slam dunk when we had these threaded holes. I thought the puller was the way to go, but clearly that was not the case. So, worst case, we can probably have this welded up. But for now, this is kind of the least of our worries. We still have a low compression engine and a starter cup that won't come off. So, pulling it off, not an option. I'm thinking the only other option we have is to apply some pressure with a crowbar and try to shock the cup off that tapered shaft. There's no real way to get under there and hammer on that crankshaft given the way that this is set up. So I'm going to try a slightly different approach here. I am going to apply a bit of pressure like last time, but hopefully stop before I break anything. And then I'm going to hammer on the puller and try to shock it off the crankshaft. Unfortunately, the starter cup, it is not coming off, and I'm afraid to apply any more force. Likely it's just going to cause more damage. So I'm going to put the brakes on this, give it a bit of thought, and come back to this in a bit. So I made a trip to the store trying to come up with an alternative to this puller right here. And really, the only thing I could see that might work was a ball bearing puller. But it wasn't quite going to work out because there's not a lot of clearance between these 2 points, and I didn't think it was going to fit. Instead, though, I did find a ball joint puller, and actually having this broken piece is going to work to our advantage because we can get it right in to where it needs to be, and then we can just crank down on this, hit it with the impact, and with any luck, this cup will pop off the shaft. Did I mention having the right tool makes the job a lot easier? And in this case, the right tool was a ball joint puller. And, if I hadn't have broken this part off, that puller would not have worked. So in a way, I guess it was a lucky break. So we have everything off that we need. So let's flip this thing over. We will get the crankcase opened up and get that piston out of there. It's definitely seen water. You can tell just by the color of the sludge. It is brown. But the lifters actually look decent. They're not rusted or pitted. So let's get the connecting rod loose. We'll get that piston and the crankshaft out. I wasn't really expecting to see all this rusty colored sludge in the bottom end. I was kind of hoping that the damage was limited to the cylinder. And, that said though, the block actually looks pretty good. Like this would clean up, but it just is an indicator that there was water in the bottom end. And now that the piston's out, you can see the bottom part of the cylinder, and there is quite a bit of rust buildup there. So, I don't think a hone is going to clean that up. And my earlier assessment of the cylinder might have been a little bit optimistic. I thought at least what we could see was all kind of cosmetic. But after going it over more carefully, the top half inch or so, it is pitted quite bad. I can feel that. So I am not really holding my breath as far as getting the cylinder cleaned up. But I do have a plan B. So we will likely resort to plan B, but we will hone this just to see what kind of progress we can make. But the rest of the internals I think are pretty good. The cap is pretty clean. The lifters looked good. Crankshaft is in good shape. And the piston and the connecting rod, surprisingly much better shape than I thought it was going to be in. The top ring is not stuck. The middle ring, though, is. So that, I would say, combined with the condition of the cylinder, is why this engine wasn't running. The camshaft, not great, but not terrible either. I think that can be cleaned up. And the cover, not in too bad a shape. Ball bearing actually feels pretty good. So really, I think the big issue here is just the stuck ring, which I think we can free up. And the cylinder, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. So let's try cleaning that up and see what kind of progress we can make. Yeah, surprisingly, the bottom cleaned up quite well. But as I feared, the top half inch especially is quite bad. And of course, that's where you have the highest compression. So, although it might run if I free up the ring, there's still going to be high leak down, increased oil consumption, and likely a loss of power. So, I do have a plan B. I think it's going to be a better plan, assuming that it works out. So let me show you plan B. So this is actually an OEM Yamaha MZ80 block. I was not setting out to buy this. I was actually looking for a clone block of an MZ80, and I couldn't find one. So, I decided to check to see how much an OEM block would cost, figuring that wouldn't work out because If you've ever priced out Yamaha parts, you know they are quite expensive, but was actually shocked to see that this, brand new, sold only for $62. So it was kind of a no-brainer. That said, though, it's not a slam dunk because clones don't copy the original exactly. There are differences. A good example would be the flywheel. The Yamaha MZ80 actually uses a real flywheel, whereas this one didn't have a flywheel. So, yeah, we may not be able to use this block, but I think until we hit a roadblock, I say we move forward with this block. And with any luck, the internals of the clone will fit properly inside of an OEM block. The Yamaha block, it doesn't come with the ball bearing or the oil seal, so I did have to buy a new ball bearing and oil seal. This was in the freezer, but I took it out for a second. I just want to test fit it on the clone crankshaft. Yeah, that is a nice snug fit. So I think we'll be okay as far as the crank goes. Let's double check the lifters and the fitment of the cam. Yeah, unfortunately, the clone lifters, they are a different diameter. They're smaller. So when I put it in the clone block and try to wiggle it, it doesn't move. But if I try it on the Yamaha block, it's pretty sloppy. So if we do use this block, we're going to need some Yamaha lifters. Yeah, camshaft fits perfect. Yeah, I think the head's going to be fine. The locating pins fit. The thread for the bolts are the same, and the holes all align properly. Cover looks good. Locating pins, they are the right size, and all the bolt holes align. So I think that only leaves the piston, which I did measure the bores. They are the same size, but I did pick up a new piston and rings. So let's try fitting that real quick into the new block. So this is the piston I got right here. This is just a clone piston, originally to be used in the clone block, but it was advertised as fitting either an MZ80 or a 148F, which is the clone designation for a Yamaha MZ80 clone. And this seems to fit in there just fine. But let's take a measurement and be sure that they're the same. So it looks like on the piston that came with the Sportsman, it's 1.91 inches. Approximately. Let's check this one. Yeah, it seems to be a little bit bigger. 6/10,000ths of an inch. Oh, maybe not. We're at 3/10,000ths. 1.9101. Yeah, so I think these are the same. They should be. So I think we'll be okay using the new piston. So I did buy a new set of rings, but let's measure the old first. See what the gap was on these rings. Now this bore, it's almost 2 inches. It's 1.91. And I don't know what the spec should be on these rings, but a good rule of thumb is 0.003 of an inch for every inch of bore gap. So I would expect about 6 thousandths minimum. And I can tell you this is, I think, a lot smaller than that. Let's try a 4. Yeah, 4 does fit. Five fits. And a 6 fits, but it's pretty tight, so I would say the old ring was a 6. At least the top ring. Let's see if we can get the second one out. And no, that second ring is stuck, so I'm going to leave that one alone. But now that we know the old rings were somewhere between a 5 and a 6, you know, that gives me something to go on here. So we'll try one of the new rings. Also looks to be a pretty tight gap. Very tight. Yeah, 6 fits. It's snug, but it's actually not as tight as the old number 1 ring. So I think that actually will be fine. Let's try the number 2 ring. Yeah, a 6 fits. And a 7 fits as well. So, yeah, the second ring gap, it is usually a little bit larger. Yeah, second ring, I think it's somewhere between a 10 and 11 thousandths. So those rings seem fine. Piston seems fine. So really the only issue I see here are the lifters. So with that in mind, I think we can put some of this together. You know, we do need to install the ball bearing, the oil seal. We can actually get the crankshaft and the piston installed. And technically, we could even install the head. Really, the only thing we can't do is install the camshaft and close up the block. So let's start by getting that ball bearing installed. So we need to heat this up to about 300 degrees. And the ball bearing, it's chilling in the freezer, so with any luck, it'll just drop in. But I do have the right size socket on standby. In case it doesn't drop in, we'll have to drive it the rest of the way in. So it took a good few minutes for this block to cool down enough to even touch. And while I was waiting for this to cool, I did order the lifters. They were only $4 each. That rule of thumb I quoted earlier of 3/1000ths of an inch for every inch of bore, that was not correct. It's actually 4/1000ths of an inch for every inch of bore. So, I double checked the Yamaha MZ80 service manual, and that confirmed it. For this engine, the minimum ring end gap is 0.008 of an inch. So I did make an adjustment. That top ring, it was too tight. So now it comes in at a nice, safe 0.009 of an inch. So we get the number 2 ring on next. Riding side should go up. In this case, it probably doesn't matter. I took a close look at the ring. There is no bevel, so both edges are the same. And this one's very hard to see, but there is writing right there. So I'm going to put that 180 degrees out from the second ring. And the oil rings, there's actually 3 on the bottom. I staggered those about 20, 20, 20. But the important rings are number 1 and number 2. So I like to space those 180 out. There we go. So the piston, it is ready more or less to install, but a couple important things to keep in mind here. The arrow should be pointing down, so it'll be installed with an orientation like this, and the connecting rod, the dipper, goes on the left side. And you also want to make sure you have the cap installed properly. There is an arrow on the top and bottom that should align. So I'm going to get the wrist pin on. I already have one circlip installed. So we'll just add a little bit of assembly lube and get that connecting rod attached. This piston ring compressor is not going to cut it. It's too big. Not sure this is going to work, but we'll try a zip tie. It worked. So there's not a whole lot more I can do right now, at least until the lifters come. So, I'm going to spend a little bit of time just cleaning up these parts. This is just some diesel fuel, so we'll clean off any loose rust. I might polish these journals a bit. Do the same for the engine cover. Then when the lifters show up, we'll finish this up. So I did put the end cover back on temporarily, just until the lifters show up. I want to keep the dust out now that everything's clean. And I also want to support the crank because I'm going to do another leakdown test. Before we redid the top end, we were at about 80% leak down. This time I'm hoping for something in the green, the lower the better. So we'll add a bit of pressure. The gauge on the left shows the pressure going in, and the one on the right shows the leak down. So when I turn this up to 100 psi, we then read the gauge on the right. And we're doing pretty good. It's about 19% leak down. So this engine should run pretty well. Well, it's been about a month since that last video clip. Getting these lifters, it turned out not to be as easy as I thought. And I placed the order to get 2 new lifters from the parts site, and they were initially estimating 3 to 5 days. Well, that estimate, it was updated promptly to a month, which I waited, and when the month came, the estimate was then updated to 4 months. So yeah, I promptly canceled that order. I was able to locate a used set from eBay for about the same price. So the lifters are here. And while I was at it, I decided to not repair this cup. I did find, I think for $27 on eBay, an actual OEM Yamaha Flywheel, which I think will be a much better part. So let's get this stuff installed. We'll finish this up and get it back on the machine. Let's make sure they fit properly. Yeah, nice and snug. Got the engine to top dead center. Yamaha calls for 4/1000 clearance on each valve. That is plus or minus 1/1000. So right there, the drag feels pretty good. So let's snug that up. We'll check it again. Four feels a little loose. Let's check a 5. 5 feels perfect. And a 6 does not fit, so the exhaust is good. Let's set the intake. A little bit of drag on the 4. And a 5 does not fit. So the valves, they are set. I think we could put the valve cover back on. There is a spot for a key on the flywheel side, but we don't actually need a key, and there wasn't a key here to begin with. You know, the key is used for timing. It's actually the taper that holds the flywheel in place. So since the timing is controlled by the pickup coil on the generator side, all we need to do is torque this down. But I'm going to hold off because the generator gets torqued to 30 foot-pounds, same as here. So if we just hold one side still, torque the other, both should be to spec. Hopefully this blower housing fits properly over the OEM flywheel and grabs the cup like it should. Perfect. Need to pull the valve cover off again. There's a tab on each side which holds this plastic piece in place. So with the valve cover on, you can't actually get this to sit down properly. So we're going to have to be very careful with the stator. The magnet is going to want to pull it in forcefully. And if that happens, I could pinch my fingers, could damage the magnets, could damage the stator. So we're going to try to do it in such a way that none of that happens. But I kind of doubt. Oop, there we go. Going to leave the connection for the airbox off for now. I'm going to do a quick test without fully getting this back together until I know that we're good. This rope, it's a little bit frayed. I wouldn't say it's on the verge of failing, but it's certainly well used. And if you've ever changed the rope on an inverter, you know it's a tough thing because the inverter module goes right up against the starter recoil. So you can't actually remove it without doing quite a bit of disassembly. So I'm thinking while we have easy access, let's swap that out now. I think we are officially together enough to give this a try. So I'm just going to top the carb off with fuel. I'm going to plug a light in. Then we'll try to start it. So if I did it right, everything that we need connected is connected. That said though, I did not connect the choke because this cable is not in very good shape. So I'm going to have to hold this manually while pulling the engine over. Try it with the choke open. And choke closed. Nice. I've got to admit, this one had me a little bit concerned. It took quite a few pulls to get this engine to fire up. Thankfully, it did fire up. The engine sounds good, and we're making power. So this is now a viable machine. That said, though, there are a couple issues. I guess the first one is the carburetor. When we started this up, I had the eco switch on, and it wasn't able to run smoothly. The engine, it was surging. With the eco switch off, it ran quite a bit better. So I'm thinking the pilot circuit, it is likely clogged up, and that would also explain the hard starting. The other issue I noticed too is that we were making a bit of smoke. So that, I think, is just oil burning off. We're going to have to run it for a few minutes to see if that clears. So I'm not too worried about that yet. For now, let's get the carb off and get it cleaned up. So I'm thinking before we clean the carb, let's try it again. Except this time with the airbox, that will richen it up. And it could richen it up just enough to fix the surge. Let's try this again. The only difference is that the airbox is fully connected, so I'm hoping that that'll get rid of the surge. We are making some progress. At least this time, the engine started second pull. But the surge, it is still there. So we do need to pull the carb and clean it up. Another observation too is that the light took a really long time to come on. So that does concern me a bit. But the fact that the engine is surging isn't helping any. So let's get the carb off, we'll get it cleaned up, and we'll try this again. I'm going to try to get this bracket off first. Might be easier while it's on the studs. Yeah, definitely a bit of varnish. A little bit of junk in the bowl. The float actually looks good. And the pin is not stuck, so we'll get that out. Needle and float look good. And next we'll get the main jet out. I don't suspect this is clogged since it's running fine at high speed. And this carburetor, it does have an emulsion tube, but it's not removable. So we'll leave that alone. Looks like we've got a tiny little fuel filter here, which wouldn't take a whole lot to clog up. And I actually noticed when I was putting fuel in the car manually, it was pretty slow to advance. And I'm willing to bet that is the reason. So I might omit that when putting it back together. Anyway, the only other thing left here is the pilot jet. That is what I suspect might be clogged. So let's get that out and make sure it's clear. Yeah, I felt a little bit clogged, but only just. All right, that's pretty much it. So I'm going to soak this for about 5, maybe 10 minutes in the ultrasonic, and then we'll try it out again. Well, it cleaned up pretty well. Not that it was that dirty to begin with. I think the exception being the bowl, but the bowl wasn't the cause of the run issue. I think the pilot jet was, although I'm not completely convinced of that because if it was clogged, it was only just. So we're not going to know for sure if the problem's fixed. We just have to put this back together, put it back on the machine, and give it another try. All right, so I'm going to get this reattached, and I'll turn you back on in a second for the test. Well, I think that did it. This time the engine started first pull. The engine ran quite well, both at low speed and high. So the carb issue, I think we can cross off the list. It is the next day, and unfortunately, the victory last night, I think, was a little bit short-lived because I went to put the tank on, and I looked in it for the first time and realized there was a bit of rust. It didn't look too bad, so I thought I'd just let it soak overnight in some Evapo-rust. And this morning, I came out to check how it was doing and discovered there were a bunch of bubbles forming in the paint, kind of all over the place. So I scratched that one, and I think it was this one right here. And unfortunately, if I tip the tank so the Evapo-rust goes to the top, you can see we are leaking. So the top of this tank, it is Swiss cheese, and although we could probably patch, all these little spots, the fact that there's so many, tell me that this tank is likely a lost cause. So yeah, unfortunately, I need a new tank. That said, though, I haven't located one yet that'll fit in this machine. So I think for now, we're going to run it off the test tank. And we also have a propane regulator, so hopefully that still works. I guess on the good news side, I was able to get this frayed wire back where it belongs. And even though it looks as bad as it does, it works just fine. It fully opens and closes the choke. And we are just about ready to get the clamshell on. This wire here, I did zip tie it out of the way of the recoil. And originally, I think there was just a zip tie kind of holding these together. And it was sandwiched between the engine and the clamshell, which doesn't seem like a lot of protection. So I'm going to add a bit of wire loom. And then I think we should be ready to get the clamshell back on. For what it's worth, the Evapo-rust did a pretty good job cleaning up the tank. So if it wasn't for all these pinholes on top, I think this tank would be perfectly usable. Anyway, if it comes to it, we can seal the tank. There's a lot of sealers out there that can seal little pinholes like this. But I do have a lead on a brand new tank. I believe it's plastic. It's made by Wen for their inverter generator, which also uses a Yamaha clone. It's not exactly the same tank, so I'm not 100% sure it's going to fit. But we'll find out in a few days when it arrives. Until that happens, this engine is not broken in. So let's get it outside and break this engine in. All right, I think we're pretty much ready to go. So for the break-in, I am going to run this on gasoline. Some manufacturers recommend it, although they don't really say why. My best guess, though, is that gasoline does provide a little bit of extra lubrication to the top end, making the break-in process a little bit less risky. And propane doesn't offer that. So I'm going to run it for a couple hours on gasoline. We'll change the oil, do it again. And for the load, I'm just going to do a light load. I have 4 lights here. The top 2 are 200 watts each. The bottom 2 are 100 watts each. So when they're all on, we'll be pulling 600 watts, which is a fairly light load, about 33% of its rated load of 1800 watts. So let's get the engine started and start the break-in. We're at the 25-minute mark, no issues to report. The smoking, it did finally stop, but it took a while. 15 minutes in, we were still smoking a bit, but now that smoke seems to be completely gone. So that is a good sign. I was starting to get a little bit worried. Well, things were going very well until they didn't. At about an hour in, the engine started surging. I heard it from far away, so I came running and was hoping that maybe the fuel was just too low. So I did elevate it, trying to stop the surge, but that had no effect. So there's a few possibilities here. Either the carb is having issues letting fuel in, or maybe we're having issues with spark. So I did shut the fuel valve off when I shut the engine down. So I'm going to pull the cover off. We'll drain the bowl and just see how much fuel is in the bowl. But when reviewing the footage over the last hour, I'm actually a lot more concerned about the inverter module itself. As we've seen, it's a little slow to come on. And what I noticed is that at about the 37-minute mark, the lights appeared to dim. So I wasn't monitoring the voltage, but if it did actually dim, then I'm thinking the inverter might be the problem here. The inverter also controls ignition. So if that's the case, then we might be at the end of the road. But yeah, let's check the fuel. We'll see how much is in the bowl. While we're at it, we'll change the oil and see if there's any clues there. Yeah, it might be a little low. There is some debris in there, but I think that might have been in the cup before. So I'm going to actually just close the drain and open the fuel valve back up. We'll give it a minute, and we'll just check again how much fuel is in the bowl. Yeah, pretty much the same amount. So we were not running out of fuel. I don't see anything concerning in the oil. There is definitely a little bit of metallic in there, but that is to be expected during break-in. So I think I'm going to refill with some new oil, and we're going to start it again. This time we're going to keep an eye on the voltage. Yeah, we're still having problems. I didn't even turn a load on this time. The voltage and the hertz, though, looked good. So, yeah, it could be a spark issue, could be an issue with the plug, the coil, or the inverter module. It could still be a fuel issue. So I think at this point I am going to make the switch to propane. If we get the same behavior, at least we can cross fuel off the list. Let's give this another try. I've got the propane connected. I did drain the carburetor of fuel, and I shut the fuel valve off. The line's also been primed, so hopefully it doesn't take too many pulls to get this started. So far so good on propane. We've got the 600 watt load back on, and the voltage, we're at 122 volts, 59.9 hertz. So let's give this some time and see what happens. We've got good news and we've got bad news. Let's start with the good. We ran for about an hour and 20 minutes this time, and during that time, the voltage in the hertz remained rock solid steady. So my earlier concerns about the inverter, I think, were unwarranted. So I went back, I double checked that video clip, and although it did appear that the lights were dimming, I think the issue was that the camera actually changed its exposure. When we started that test, the generator and the lights, they were in the sun, and then a shadow moved across them as the sun kind of got in the way of this tree. So I don't think we have an inverter issue. That said, though, we do have a run issue. Like last time, we ran for about an hour, and then the engine started to have issues. It was backfiring, it was running rough, which to me indicates an ignition problem. So I think the easy thing to do here would be to swap the plug out, but I don't have another for this engine, so I do have to order it. So I think we're shut down for today. I'm just going to change the oil, we'll put some fresh stuff in, and we'll have to continue this on another day. A new plug showed up today, so I'm going to get this installed and we'll try this again. Yeah, for what it's worth, too, this Autolite plug, it was brand new before we got this engine to fire up. So I would be surprised if this was it. Also, according to the Sportsman manual, this plug is 2 heat ranges too hot. So potentially that has something to do with it. So my hope is obviously that this will fix it. If it doesn't, then really the only other thing we can try is swapping out the coil. Yeah, this time I'm going to run it on gasoline. The misfire seemed to happen a little bit sooner when running on that fuel. So, it's going to be the same test, different day, different plug, hopefully different results. Well, that didn't take very long. It ran for about 4 minutes, started to backfire, and shut down. So it's not the spark plug. So really that only leaves the coil or the CDI, which is part of the inverter, which we cannot replace. So I am going to go shopping for a new coil, and we'll give that a try. I was just taking a look online, trying to locate another coil for this machine, and kind of came up empty. There were coils that looked similar, kind of like the one that came on this machine, but of course that one didn't work. So I wasn't in a huge rush to order it. I pulled the covers off on both sides, just trying to see if there was any sign of a problem. And I think I did find the problem. You know, this wire loom actually melted right there. And if you look at this connector, it is all distorted. And that definitely could explain what we're seeing here. You know, because if these wires aren't properly connected, then we're not going to get spark when we should. So, yeah, given that this connector is bad, and that I haven't been able to find another coil, I'm thinking for now, let's just cut the connector out. We will direct wire these and probably move this more forward away from the heat and try this again. Yeah, I'm not sure about this one. Although the connector is melted, it seems to be making a good connection. So wiring it direct, not so sure that's going to fix our problem here. Not going to shrink these down yet until we have some evidence that this is now working properly. Plus, apparently it's pretty hot in here, so they might shrink themselves down. All back together. Let's try this again. I was going to say, let's just make sure a spark is the issue, but I'm looking down here and I can see the carb. It is flooding over. So, yeah, I guess now I'm confused. Is it a spark issue or not? Because we had the same issue when running on propane. But yeah, maybe we have multiple issues going on here. So I just shut the fuel off. I'm going to drain the carb. Let's try this on propane while monitoring the spark. Let's try this again. This time on propane, back cover is still off. So if it starts to struggle again, I'll run around, we'll focus in on it and see if that light is going out. Definitely a spark issue. Okay, good. This test gave me a lot of useful information. So we do have multiple issues going on. First, the carburetor was flooding over. I think that caused the last two shutdowns. And then this time, when running on propane, we ran quite a bit longer. We actually ran for 30 minutes before the engine started to misfire. And having the spark tester on there told me 100% that we are losing spark. So I think we just need a new coil. Got a couple updates. I guess first off, I'm losing the sun, but more importantly, the spark problem. I pulled out the original coil, the one that came on this machine that did not produce spark. I cut off the ends and connected it like it should have been, yellow to red, blue to green. That's how the connector was set up. When I did that, I didn't get anything. So I reversed the two leads, so now the yellow is going to green and the blue to red. And in this configuration, we actually have spark. Let me show you. So the bad coil, I think, is actually good. It was just wired wrong in the connector. So let me get the bad one off the machine. We'll get this new one in, wired like this, and we'll try it again. Yeah, I think this is going to be the last attempt today. It is starting to get dark out, but we are fully back together, and we have that other coil now wired in. So let's start it, and hopefully this time it stays running. I don't want to jinx it, but we've been running now for an hour and 10 minutes, so this is the longest I think it has run, and it hasn't missed a beat at all during that time, so I'm going to give it at least another half hour, and we'll check back. We just passed the 2-hour mark, and this thing has run flawlessly. So I think the ignition problems are squared away. So I'm going to take the load off, let the engine cool down, and then we'll shut it down. I brought the oil inside just so you could get a better look at it. You know, this is after 2 hours of runtime, plus a few failed attempts, and you can see it's coming out pretty clean now. A lot better than the first oil change. Yeah, it took a long time to get here, but I think we're finally here. You know, all of the ignition issues have been solved, even the leaking carb. I think that issue is a non-issue. You know, likely there was a piece of debris in there. So we are replumbed in to gasoline. The fuel valve is on, and we're not leaking at all. But I am going to leave this back cover off just to keep an eye on it. Anyway, this machine, it is rated at 1800 watts. So I'm going to try to pull 1800 out of it, and hopefully it can deliver. And no issues getting it started. Started first pull. Without a load, THD is pretty low at 0.4%, and the sine wave looks pretty much perfect. So we'll give this a few minutes, and then we'll bring on the load. Watts, no issue. THD jumped to 1.3%. The sine wave still looks pretty good. At 1500 watts, it's running pretty well. 1.5% THD, and the sine wave looks unchanged. So we'll give this a few minutes, and then we'll add a little bit more to the load. Well, it's been pulling 1500 watts with confidence for a few minutes. So let's bring it up to the max of 1800. So if I turn one of these top lights on, that's going to add 200 watts into the mix. So right now we're pulling approximately 700 watts. And then one of these bottom lights adds another 100 watts. So now we're at 1800 watts, and it's doing it just fine. Let's see what the THD is at. Jumped up again. 2%, but still quite low. The sine wave looks good. Same test, but this time we are running on propane. The gasoline, it has been disconnected and set aside. That said though, there is still a bit of gasoline in the carburetor, so I'm going to use that to start the engine. It's a lot easier to start it on gasoline, and then when it's about to run out, I'm going to open up that valve and transition to propane. At 1500 watts, no issues to report. You know, the power quality, that's not going to change based on the fuel, but the horsepower will. So we should be able to turn on one of these for an extra 100 watts. So now we're pulling 1600, and there's no signs that the engine is struggling. So let's swap that out for 200. Okay, yeah. And there I can hear it is struggling. Now it's racing up quite a bit, so I'm going to turn that off. So 1600 watts, that's all it can do on propane, which is fine because that's all it's supposed to do. I almost forgot the most important test here. We're going to load test the USB. So we're at 5.04 volts, pulling about 1 amp. So I'm just going to increase the load until we start to see that voltage drop to less than 5 volts. So right there we're at 2 amps. Still holding at 5 volts. Two and a half amps. That's pretty impressive actually. So at just over 3 amps, the voltage started to drop. So this would actually charge your phone pretty fast. Not too bad. Well guys, that's pretty much a wrap. You know, for a while there I wasn't sure we were going to get this one back up and running. You know, I've never tried repairing a clone of a Yamaha MZ80. Never mind a Yamaha. You know, I wasn't sure if the Yamaha parts would fit, but thankfully they did. For about $150, we got this engine up and running again, only to be greeted by ignition problems. That actually ended up being a lot more challenging to chase down because I couldn't find the proper coil. And thankfully, the coil that didn't work actually works when you flip the wires. So in the configuration that it's in now, you know, this machine is running very well. Anyway, you know, as far as the tank goes, that is still a few days out. And I'm actually having kind of second thoughts on using that because the original tank, it was metal. And seeing the melted plastic components in there kind of reminded me that plastic tanks need extra heat shielding, so I don't think putting that in here is a good idea. Not to mention, running on propane, a tank that sized, it's going to run this machine about 3 times longer than a full tank of gasoline. So likely, I'm going to leave this as a propane-only generator. So, I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.